Such a bright day. Actually, I prefer when it's raining, but bright days such as this one remind me of the god Freyr, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today. You see, 2 years ago I've made my very first video and it was about this deity. But it was just a test to see the kind of feedback I would receive and how comfortable I felt in front of a camera. Actually, I still don't feel very comfortable in front of a camera, but that's another matter. Anyway, after that video I didn't step on YouTube. I haven't made any video for an entire year. I was just waiting for the feedback, and it was really positive and gave me the motivation to officially start a YouTube channel. But because it was just a test, there was a lot left unsaid and it was awkward, so I decided to remake that video. And today I came back to the place where it all started. So if you don't mind, let's take a walk, shall we? Freyr is the Norse god of fertility, the embodiment of the powers of fertility, of both the animals and the soil, and of course of human fecundity. He is often associated as the god of agriculture. But was this deity just a fertility god, or was there more to him? Good gods, there are literally chickens fighting at my feet. Freyr's name might come from the Proto-Nordic Fraujas, with the possible meaning of referring to something which is ahead, forward, uppermost, meaning the uppermost or lord, as in ruler. Fraujas is very similar to the Gothic word Frauja, also meaning lord, Proto-Germanic Fraujan and Old English Freya. There seems to be clear evidences that the god Freyr was much more than just a mere god of agriculture. I've said this before on other videos. Before the introduction of the cult of Odin in Scandinavia, there were other gods highly worshipped, and Freyr was one of such gods. In Sweden, for instance, Freyr was one of the most, if not the most, worshipped deity. He was a god associated with peace and prosperity, with light, the embodiment of the very emotions light awakens in mortal beings. In Uppsala, in Sweden, where the major sacrifices took place, it was said that the god Freyr himself was buried there, and for as long as he remained in the ground, the land will always have peace and prosperity and fertility. People sacrificed to him to ensure the continuation of this peace and prosperity. However, with the introduction of the cult of Odin in Scandinavia, Freyr lost some of his attributes as a major god. Kings were always the first to be converted to new faiths. In great urban centers of power, everyone adopted the main religion of rulers. Odin was the god of rulers. There's no dispute. As such, Odin became the main deity, highly worshipped, the official god of kings, while in the countryside, in remote areas, where new faiths took their time to be accepted, people maintained their old traditions and gods. Freyr continued to be worshipped in remote areas, in rural areas. As such, he lost his title as lord, as chieftain deity of the gods, and became associated with agriculture, because after the introduction of the cult of Odin, Freyr became the farmer's god. Freyr has always been a fertility god, but fertility associated with the power of the sun, a solar deity. Freyr was a king god, a sovereignty in the Norse pantheon, in addition to his role as a fertility god. But he lost his title as king with the introduction of the cult of Odin, as I've said. Freyr had the function of a ruler deity, the counterpart of the human king, the figure whose power was capable of bringing peace and prosperity to the land and to his subjects. Let's take into consideration a few aspects which prove the existence of other functions of this deity besides his functions as a fertility god. It's mainly from the prose Edda that we got the idea, the image of Freyr being a fertility god, a god of agriculture. He is represented as the most glorious of the Aesir, a ruler of both rain and sunshine, and prosperity and peace. The prose Edda is the main written source which describes Freyr as a pure fertility god, and since this work was the main source of modern study of Old Norse mythology, the idea that Freyr was a Scandinavian fertility god was frequently reproduced in research for decades, reinforcing the idea that Freyr was only a fertility god. However, the Old Norse myths and heroic narratives transmitted by Snorri Sturluson were influenced by medieval Christian thinking. Snorri composed mythological novellas by reworking the old traditions. These novellas, in a way, completely lost their value in terms of demonstrating the pagan thinking and trying to reconstruct the pre-Christian religion, precisely because of the fact that they have Christian influences. Before the Christian influence on Old Norse mythology and taking into consideration the archaeological findings and etymological studies, Freyr was much more important than previously thought, a crucial god in the ability to give luck and particularly fertility and peace of the entire land and all living creatures within the domains of this deity. This god also had links to rulership and military aspects. He appears in the material sources as a warrior lord with martial features who defended peace, which makes sense. If Freyr is a god of peace, in a warlike culture peace can only be maintained if there is someone to keep it by defending it, or as it is often said, peace can only be found on the other side of war. When Freyr was worshipped, it was not only for good harvests, but also for a life of peace and harmony. Freyr was the divine counterpart of the sacred king. As I have said, the embodiment of the figure who is capable of bringing peace to the land by correctly applying his kingly powers. Freyr was one of the most important gods in the Nordic pantheon, and his function was not limited to fertility. Freyr seems not only to have been a divine lord who watches over fertility, but also watched over cosmic peace and peace within the society. In order to protect the cosmos against the forces of chaos, he also appears at times as a warrior lord. Based on these characteristics and functions, which we find in both the myths and cultural material contexts, Freyr also had a central role in the ruler ideology of pre-Christian Scandinavia. The ruler ideology expressed in Freyr can be seen in the myths and poetic works which indicate that Freyr as a Vanir god was some sort of prince, a warrior chieftain of the Vanir tribe of gods. Also, we must take into consideration the representations of Freyr in different mythological traditions, which indicate that Freyr is the divine counterpart of the ideal king, the ruler who is responsible for crops and peace. Look at this fellow, he beat me once and it wasn't pleasant. Well, I would like to talk about horses. This isn't a horse, but he bites like one. Anyway, I have already spoken about Uppsala and the sacrifices held in there in honor of the god Freyr. Horses were very important in the spiritual panorama of Indo-European cultures, and as such, Freyr, being a divine lord, had to be connected with horses, of course. It's true that it's hard to find connections between Freyr and horses, but of all the 7 different animal species sacrificed at Uppsala, and not forgetting that there was the belief that Freyr himself was buried there, horses were the animals mostly sacrificed at Uppsala, or any other place for that matter. Horses had a connection with kings, rulers, a noble animal, often sacrificed in burials of people with great distinction or in burials of people who were believed to have achieved divinity or had a very strong and magical connection with the divine. The horse was also a spiritual symbol of the shamanic journey, the animal used in the spiritual journey into the world of the spirits. And let's not forget that in Old Norse societies, animals were sacrificed to facilitate the contact with the deities with whom certain animals were linked to. Sacrificing horses was to facilitate the contact with Freyr before Odin became associated with horses. You see, if horses were connected to nobility and Odin replaced Freyr as a divine ruler, then horses had to be linked to Odin because he was the new divine representation of the ideal king. Also, I think it's important to refer this, Freyr is often depicted as riding a boar, and not a horse. The boar was an older symbol related to rulership, chieftains, kings, and nobility, which reinforces the idea of Freyr being related to the ruler ideology. However, there are accounts of Freyr riding a horse as well, Blargolfi, bloody hoof, continuing to reinforce this god's connection with lordship and with spiritual journey. Well, I think it's time to go into a quieter place and continue our talk about the god Freyr. So see you in a second back home. Alright, so we have other names, other titles which reinforce the idea of Freyr being a warrior lord and the divine archetype of a king. We have names such as Halsahjadar, protector of the Heisir or the gods, Folkvaldigoda, war leader of the gods, Bodfrodre, battle skilled, Oftingi, simply lord or chieftain. In the death of the god Balder, in all that funerary process, Freyr clearly appears as a chieftain when he rides at the head of the gods, when they are going to the pyre where Balder was laid, at the head of the funerary procession. Now, Freyr is often referred to as a fertility god because of the modern studies of Old Norse mythology based solely on the prose Edda. He was also a fertility god, but in truth there are more references of him being a prince, ruler, chieftain, king and warrior lord than being the fertile one. Freyr's importance in Old Norse societies was far greater than we thought. In the Ynglinga saga, Freyr is even referred to as Varaldargod, god of the world. So it seems Freyr was once a divine lord who ruled over the world. Now there is another aspect I would like to talk about concerning the god Freyr. You know how important the concept of ancestors was to the Norse societies, the ancestors being a source of knowledge and help in daily life, but also the importance of bloodlines, the importance to refer one's lineage, because there was the belief that the very essence of the ancestors could pass into their descendants, their characteristics, skills, attributes, particularly if people had the same name of their ancestors, which would help to call upon the ancestor itself to help his namesake. Now, Freyr is also closely related to bloodlines and ancestry. He has a close association with pre-Christian royal families, which are referred to in poems and prose narratives. In several sources, he is perceived as a divine ancestor of the famous family or clan of the Ynglingar. They considered themselves as Freyr's offspring. These sources indicate that Freyr was even regarded as a king or prince, reinforcing the importance of this deity as an important symbol of the ruler ideology. You might be wondering how on earth a god can have mortal children. It wasn't that odd or nonsensical that the fact that gods could be the fathers and mothers of mortals in social pagan conscience of old. As I've said before, there was the belief that Freyr himself was buried at Uppsala, and as long as he remained there, the land would have peace and prosperity. This belief is not exclusive of Freyr. There are other burials, including burials at Uppsala, of people who achieved divinity through their deeds as mortals. This is also a Celtic belief, and Roman and many other cultures, of course. As it is often said in Celtic mythology, gods became heroes and heroes became gods. In the Norse religious beliefs, this was also true. The gods could walk among mortals and mortals could become gods. Now, going back to the subject, as far as we can follow the Ynglinga's royal line and the tradition concerning this family, Freyr seems to have a special status as the family's divine ancestor. Not just this family, for instance, Freyr also has a connection with other great dynasties such as the Lendajarlar in Norway. According to the tradition, it seems that Freyr competed with Odin for that position, to be the ancestor of such families. And in here we can see perhaps the religious and social struggle between those who kept the old faith, believing that Freyr was a king god, a sovereign god, and those who kept the new faith, believing that Odin was the All Father, the king of the gods. Some families prided themselves as being the descendants of Odin, and others to be the descendants of Freyr. The struggle between two different pagan faiths of Northern Europe. Freyr was a patron of both the earthly and the cosmic order. This may be one of the reasons why people invoked Freyr when someone broke the law, or broke peace and harmony within a temple or any other sacred place. Freyr was called upon to punish people who broke the law. This happened with King Eirik, for instance, who violated the assembly peace and desecrated the sanctuary. Freyr was invoked and asked to drive away the desecrator of the country. This can be read in Egil Saga. So according to the mythical traditions, it seems as if Freyr also protected the earth and the cosmos against disorder and conducted military struggles against the forces of chaos. Some of Freyr's possessions reinforce the connection this deity has with war and defense, such as owning a powerful sword that fights for itself, a great ship which was so big that all the gods were able to go aboard it, with weapons and war gear, his accounts of slaying giants, the fight against Surtr during Ragnarok, the war boar he rides, etc. These mythological accounts should probably be linked with Freyr's protective functions and striving for peace. Being a god with warrior traits and also linked to fertility may imply that there must be peace in a society and balance in the cosmos for the land to be able to produce good crops. It is the king god Freyr's task to watch over this cosmic peace and fertility, sometimes by military means, reinforcing the ideology of the perfect ruler. The mortal king should hold the same responsibilities to maintain peace, order, and fertility in his domains. So in conclusion, Freyr wasn't just a fertility god or a god of agriculture as it is often referred in modern research of Old Norse mythology. Freyr was once a king god, a personification of the same responsibilities a human ruler needed to watch over harvests and peace, being both the attacker and the defender in order to maintain peace and harmony, always struggling against chaotic forces which would disrupt the harmony in the land. Freyr's features indicate that he was a sovereign god who held both warrior and fertility traits. With the introduction of the cult of Odin in the north, especially in Sweden, Freyr lost his title as king, but it seems the religious struggle was there and certain families kept the old faith of Freyr and others kept the faith of Odin. Nevertheless, both gods were highly worshipped. Freyr was called upon for good harvests, peace, harmony, prosperity, fertility, to bless weddings, and most likely called for matters of war. He was certainly called upon to drive away disruptors of peace and harmony, desecrators of temples and assemblies and other sacred places. So it's not surprising that sacrifices were frequently in honor of Freyr at various occasions. During harvest festivals, for instance, the animal sacrificed was traditionally Freyr's animal, the boar. Sacrifices for peace and plenty at the major annual sacrifices, or the ones every 9 years, The sacred animal, the sacrificed animal, was the horse, which was also linked to Freyr, not only as an animal linked to war, but also nobility and spiritual journeys, to use the animal as the vessel to communicate with the divine. And since there is also a connection between Freyr and ships, as I have said, this deity owned a great and important warship, it might be suggested that Freyr was probably called upon for particular ritual purposes concerning the construction of ships that were never meant to be seaworthy. Ships for burials or to house specific individuals after death who had an important connection with the divine, or they themselves being divine. We know from archaeological evidences, of course, that ships played a major role in the pre-Christian religious rites of the Scandinavian peoples. Alright friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I smell of horse and chickens. I hope it was worth it. Well, I actually like the smell. I like farm smells for some reason. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed and see you on the next video. And tack för idag!